Hi everyone, it is Toby from Toby's Urban Sketch, and thank you very much for joining me. Today we're doing one of my famous places sketches. This is a recommendation from you guys, and it is Sydney Opera House. This is the finished, very loose sketch, which hopefully you can recognise the Opera House itself. Um, as I always say, please do ask me any questions you have in the comments, and please recommend me somewhere to sketch next. Um, I would love to just get some inspiration, ideas from you, and also perhaps help put my spin on a project you might be interested in seeing or having a bit of difficulty producing yourself. Um, through this sketch, we will talk about how we take something super recognizable and avoid having to just make it perfect to make it recognizable, and put our own spin on it, and have a bit of fun, and loosen up and just enjoy the sketching. So without further ado, let's have a look at how we can create this sketch. So with that, it's time to start our sketching. So what I'm using today, I bought a little selection of papers. So I'm going to be trying out a few different types of paper. This one is, as you can see, Saunders Waterford from St Cuthbert's Mill, and it is their cold pressed knot sheet. It's 300 grams per metre squared, which is a nice a nice weight, which means it doesn't buckle too much, but it's also not too expensive. The thicker you get the paper, the heavier the paper, the more expensive it tends to be. And it has quite a light texture. It's cold pressed, but with quite a nice light texture. I'm going to flip that over, and we'll be, of course, sketching on the unprinted side here. The other thing that I'm going to be using, which I have used in videos before, is this Fudensok. So I always get this wrong. Fudensok. The other thing that we're going to be using, which is a bit different from usual, but I have used in the past, is this Tombow Fude pen, and I've used a Sailor Fude pen before, and someone very kindly I pronounced it Fude, but apparently it's Fude. So Fude pen. This is a sort of light felt pen rather than being a traditional Fude pen, which is a fountain pen with a bent nib. If I just show you on this side of the paper, it produces a similar effect. It means you can go from very fine through to very bold. So it produces a lovely broad range of lines. And whilst I was away on holiday doing lots of sketching, I took this pen with me. I hadn't used it for a few months, and I really enjoyed it. And so I thought, let's do a couple of videos using this pen. Now, with all of that, we should get sketching. So thank you very much for suggesting this this image, or this place, Sydney Opera House. And I'm just going to start sketching. Now, with something so incredibly recognisable as Sydney Opera House, I think it's quite important to either spend a very long time getting it right, or my version, of course, is to be loose and just express what you think about the place, or take a feature of it but have some fun with it, rather than feeling you're trying to necessarily totally recreate the exact place. Now, I chose this particular angle, this view, because it's got more than just the Opera House in. So all of these buildings in the background provide just a bit more going on in the image. So if we're drawing what is almost like a portrait of a place, we don't have to just have that place in massive in front of us. We can choose to take something else as well, make that more of make the what's going to be the Opera House more of a part of the image, less of just the image entirely being about that. And that lets you be a bit looser, lets you sort of be forgiven for some of the mistakes you made. Here I've done a little silhouette capturing some of these buildings and done it as a continuous line, as you probably noticed. Then I'm going to build in the Opera House. So I'm going to expand it a little bit so it's a bit bigger. So it is a bit more about the Opera House and a bit less in the background, as it is in the reference. It's in the reference, it'd probably be about this tall instead of this tall. And then I'm just going to sort of go and start getting the big shapes. And what are the big shapes? It's kind of these petal type shapes, really, isn't it? And that's what makes this structure so recognisable. And then just finding each of these little petals and getting them about right. Doesn't have to be perfect. About right. And then this image becomes about just sort of expressing these shapes. At least that's what I think it's going to be about, and we'll see how it progresses. But at the moment it's about expressing these shapes compared to these sort of background shapes. And there, so they're all pretty much captured. Now we can just do the internal lines in a couple of places. And then we can continue getting these kind of silhouette horizon line type thing going on in the background off to the right. Aiming to sort of finish it about symmetrically with this side. So you can see we've got about the same amount of paper. Then I'm going to just come in underneath and start getting in these other parts of our actual subject. And just really we're focusing on it as shapes. So these are kind of rectangles. And at the very bottom we've got this sort of swooping, curving structure. And then we've got a lot of shade and things going on. And rather than drawing in the lines of the shade, I'm just going to do some hatching. And with this pen, which is bolder than what I'd normally use, this hatching becomes quite immediately rather bold. And we can start finding some other lines and other bits of shape as we do this as well. So you might want, for example, inside this little petal, you've got just a suggestion of some other shapes, so we can just do that and then continue our hatching. Same up here, just a nice hatching. And there's also shadow going on some of the backs of these petals, so we just can simulate that at the same time. And nice bright bit here, isn't there? So if we bring that line out, we can then hatch inside it. And then you see all of this is shadow, so all I'm going to do is keep this theme of hatching. And that way we haven't drawn the lines, but we're just really sort of most definitely suggesting them. And maybe we'll come back and add some lines, but we're going to start with far more of a loose suggestion. And we can just replicate that over here. Even though the shadow is very different, we're making our own version of this image. We're making our own art. So we can take a motif that we've used elsewhere and we can apply it somewhere where it doesn't necessarily ring as true. And then I'm going to, like I said, do some lines so we can get a little bit of this kind of idea of line work, just to square off these shadows, not trying to be too clever, too specific about it. And then we can come in and just get the idea of some sea, well, it's not quite sea, is it, but an estuary, I think. And we're just sort of building that that interest throughout the image. And I think that's probably enough for our line work. So what we've got these loose silhouettes either side. We've made this whole image about more than just the opera house. And then we very quickly made the opera house just from these key shapes before moving on and adding a little bit of just simple hatching for simple suggestion of shadows. Next I'm going to do some very loose colour. So we've got a size 2 mop brush. This is about size 10 or 12 in a sort of normal brush, in a round brush, but it holds a bit more water. You can see it's got quite a fat belly here, and what that means is we can be very loose in our application of colour. I'm going to start, because this is Australia, of course, I'm going to start with some loose sky, nice blue loose sky. Now this pen is waterproof, but you can see because it's a bolder line, in some of these places where I've hatched, the colour's leaking. And I didn't expect that, but it's fine. It's part of experimenting with different things. So perhaps I could have left it to dry a bit longer, and then we would have a cleaner image, but given my style, I really don't mind it when these kind of things happen. And I've never used this paper before either, so it's going to be really interesting to see how the colour reacts, how the watercolours move. And you can see it's a very light texture, but so with cold pressed paper, it's often a bit more absorbent than hot pressed paper. So rather than the water pooling on the surface like it does with hot press, you can see it's actually quite an absorbent paper. Now I've not taped it down, but it's so far doing quite a good job of not buckling, so that's a positive finding as well. Just going to do a few splashes. And I've recently started really enjoying making these kind of loops in the sky, and there's no good reason for that other than I just enjoy the effect that they bring. It's just another way of sort of applying colour and then letting the water move it around. And again, just a few taps. And if I just take some water onto my brush, we can see if we can get a few little inverse cauliflowers, which I think are really lovely effects in the sky, where the water just pushes away that pigment you've put on. And I'm being relatively neat initially in how the colour meets our sort of focal point. But as we progress, what I'll probably do, so I've got a little bit of indigo here and a little bit of sepia to make a sort of slightly, maybe just warm shadow colour. And I'm going to start touching that in quite gently into our sort of hatched areas. What I'm expecting is, with the paper still being wet, this shadow is going to seep up into areas where the sky is wet. That's the kind of effect that I try and achieve. Now there's no need to make the colours realistic. In the earlier one of this series I did Tower Bridge in London, and the colours are certainly not realistic. Equally, there's no need to necessarily add colour. We could leave everything completely white. We could leave the Opera House as a totally sort of white structure. Or we could try and find some of the hues which are there. So there's lots of nice yellows and things. There's also, I think, to my eye, at least on my screen that I'm using, there's some nice purples. So that's where I'm getting these purples going into the sea, kind of like reflections coming towards us. And tell me if you agree or not, that there's sort of these purpley reflections and gold reflections coming towards us. And then around that, of course, the sea reflects the sky, so we can just pop in some blues. So now we've got this kind of interesting image, reflections, basic shapes. And the last bit is to think about, like I said before, perhaps those golds, those yellows. So let's try some gold as an initial step. So I've got some quinacridone gold, and I'm just going to drop it in. And I'm going to drop it in places where I see some yellow. I'm going to drop it in places where I just think the image can take it or would benefit from it. And I'm wanting it to do this leaking effect, this moving around. I think just the blending and blurring of colours like this is one of the best things, the best thing about watercolours perhaps. So I'm hoping that we get these lovely effects where it drips and does its own thing and moves around. We could even stimulate that a little more by tapping our page, and then everything will move around a bit more. And having done that, we can come back in with some of those colours we've been using. So this is my purple, which I didn't say before, but it's Perylene Violet. And we can reintroduce it where we think perhaps, a little bit more would be nice, now that we've got that lovely bright colour in as well. And then if it's gone too far, too purpley, well, come back in with our sepia and indigo colours, deepen the shadows, make them a little less sort of punchy in that sense. And just little by little, careful not to overdo it. Perhaps come into the background and add a few suggestions of shadow. Just shows that you're dealing with some big vertical objects if you have these vertical shadows coming down. And same here, you can just suggest a few shadows, either invented or taken from the image. And then, because I like them, a few splashes again into the sea. And I think it would be nice to have just a little bit of extra gold as well. And we can splash that around as well. And there you go. I would call this done. So, I'm gonna, of course, put my little signature on it. And since it's a famous place, I'll pop Sydney Opera House. And the date today, which is, I have to remind myself, the 16th of February. That's when I'm sketching this image for you. And that's done. So again, thank you very much for suggesting this. A few people suggested this as an image to do. I think it's a really challenging one because it's not a square. It's not just made of our normal building shapes. It's not got windows. But we can simplify it. We can take it to its essential shapes. We can have fun with it. We can decide what our image is about. So for me, this has become about those shapes and those bleeding colours and finding those funny purples and things. And again, feel free to disagree with me about what colours are actually in this image in real life. And at the end, we have this really fun, interesting image. And it didn't take us all that long, 15 minutes. We had a bit of fun with it. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. Please do let me know in the comments. Give me somewhere you'd like me to sketch as well. Send me a link if you have a nice photo in particular to use, and let me know what you think of this in general. And of course, it means the world if you do subscribe if you enjoy watching my channel. Thank you very much. Here's a bit which needs a touch.